Executive Director of the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society at Boston College. I'm so happy to welcome all of you. All 450 of you have registered to the second event from the Schiller Institute in our continuing series on confronting environmental racism. This event is co-sponsored by the Departments of History and Engineering, the African and African Diaspora Studies Program, the Environmental Studies Program, and the Black Student Forum, and is held in honor of Black History Month. At the Schiller Institute, we emphasize grappling with issues at the intersections of society and energy, environment, and health. It really would be hard to find a more appropriate topic for the Institute to address than environmental justice and race. The disparities which communities of color face in terms of exposure to environmental contamination and its consequent dangerous and deadly health effects call out for rigorous examination from a multitude of perspectives. In fact, the disasters we've just witnessed in Texas, with the dismaying effects of the snowstorm and the resulting complete breakdown of the power grid and water supply systems, amplifies the need for this type of interdisciplinary analysis. So in this panel, we will introduce you to three extraordinary individuals who have explored environmental racism from their individual viewpoints, representing history, engineering, and sociology, and each of whom have undertaken action to combat environmental racism in their own realms of knowledge and personal experience. And then as a follow-up to this panel, the Schiller Institute is sponsoring projects for students to pursue an original idea exploring environmental racism on their own terms. Boston College faculty are invited to participate also through their courses. We'll provide the URL for the website sign up for these projects on the chat during this webinar. So what I want to do now is introduce our panelists and our esteemed moderator. We've asked each panelist to present some initial thoughts for about 15 minutes. And then we'll follow these presentations with about 15 minutes of moderated discussion, and then spend the next 20 minutes or so in a Q&A session with you, our viewers. So let me now introduce our panel, our first panelist. And I'll introduce all the panelists in order, and then each panelist will begin their presentation. So our first panelist is Dr. Rick Mizelle. Dr. Mizelle is a history professor at the University of Houston. Professor Mizelle is the author of Backwater Blues, the Mississippi Flood of 1927 in the African-American Imagination. And he is also co-editor of Resilience and Opportunity, Lessons from the US Gulf Coast After Katrina and Rita. Dr. Mizelle is currently writing a history of race and diabetes in the 20th century, and he is co-editing the Oxford Handbook of American Medical History. Dr. Kimberly Jones is Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Education and Professor and Chair of the Department of Environmental and Civil Engineering at Howard University. Dr. Jones holds a PhD in Environmental Engineering. Among her many appointments and awards, Dr. Jones has served on the Science Advisory Board of the US EPA and on the National Academy of Sciences Water Technology Board. And she received a Top Women in Science Award from the National Technical Association and Top Women Achievers Award from Essence Magazine. Mr. Adin Henderson, a Newton, Massachusetts local, is a senior in the Environmental Studies program at Boston College. Mr. Henderson is the co-president of the Black Student Forum at BC, as well as the AHANA Plus Outreach Coordinator. He has worked with the environmental nonprofit group Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. And Mr. Henderson is currently completing his honors thesis entitled The Impact of Socioeconomic Status on Individual Perceptions of Environmental Risk. Our conversation today will be moderated by Dr. Conevery, Bolton, Valencius. Professor Valencius teaches and writes about American environments and American science and medicine. She's a member of the Department of History at Boston College. Following up on Dr. Valencius's book, The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes, Dr. Valencius is currently working on a book about earthquakes and contemporary energy. We are thrilled that she is able to moderate this conversation this afternoon. Dr. Mizelle, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to first thank the Schiller Institute for the wonderful opportunity to speak, and also to you, Laura Steinberg and Conevery, Bolton, Valencius, for the invitation. And I'm happy to share this stage with Professor Kimberly Jones and Adin Henderson. It's been a little bit of a long week here in Texas. I'm still dealing with some brown water issues, but I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to have this discussion. And it's quite relevant for what's been going on here in Houston and Texas for the last week. I am trained as really a historian of medicine, but also with a focus on environment, technology, and race. And so part of my early research, or much of my early research, really dealt with the history of environmental disasters. And my first book was on the 1927 Mississippi River flood. And part of the argument of that book is that African Americans suffered from a double environmental burden. Essentially that it was not only the flood waters that created the harm for African Americans, but in the immediate aftermath, many African Americans still dealt with the environment of racism and inequality, to the point that many African Americans were forced to labor on levee camps, and also prevented from moving around the landscape, keeping in mind that this was during the moment of the Great Migration. And as many African Americans sought to start life anew, their movement across the landscape was constricted and prevented through the use of violence. And so part of my argument for these earlier projects and for us to think about is the long history of environmental racism. And I've committed part of my early research to really thinking about how we can take this concept of white supremacy and environmental racism as a theory and think about that in the historical past. Another project that I worked on, which I was kind of personal for me, was the back-to-back storms of Princeville, North Carolina in 1999. Princeville, as you may know, was hit by back-to-back storms, Hurricanes Dennis and Floyd in 1999. Princeville, which is a predominantly Black community founded by former slaves in the aftermath of the Civil War, we're experiencing various forms of environmental racism, from the inability to access resources from the state before the disaster to the immediate aftermath of the disaster, in which they failed to receive some of the resources that other communities were getting from the American Red Cross, but also from the state legislature. And so in the aftermath of the disaster, they set up what were called FEMAvilles, or Camp Depression, as a way of sort of dealing with these issues. But it also showed sort of the continuing legacy of environment and environmental racism. Importantly, during the Princeville floods, there were rumors that in many ways were confirmed that an upstream town, Rocky Mount, opened the floodgates and allowed water to go to Princeville down the Tar River to alleviate the pressure on the water system in Rocky Mount, but in the process, bringing possibly devastation to Princeville. And I've also done a lot of research on Hurricane Katrina. And there's so much work that's being done on Hurricane Katrina now, but a lot of my work has focused on thinking about the landscape. Katrina was not just one moment in time. It was a multi-generational disaster, decades, if not a century in the making. And so when we think about not just New Orleans, but the Gulf Coast, in New Orleans in particular, many individuals who suffered the most did not have automobiles or did not have access to automobiles. And so the the rule for evacuation planning for New Orleans then, as it really is today, is to get in your automobile and drive away. And those individuals who were able to get in an automobile and evacuate were the ones who were most likely to evade the storm. Those who did not have an automobile were more likely to find themselves in the New Orleans Superdome or the Louisiana airport. And so, in the aftermath of Katrina, there was a lot of conversation around automobile ownership, the higher prices that many African Americans who live in certain neighborhoods have to pay, what they call the higher sticker price or the poverty tax, higher insurance rates, higher than normal prices for gas in certain neighborhoods, and higher, parking fees in certain neighborhoods. So there was, in many ways, an infrastructure that made it difficult for many African Americans to own automobiles, which then made it difficult to evacuate. In a piece I published in the journal ISIS last year this time, I talked about people who were diabetic and who were suffering from amputations and skin breaks. One of the complications for diabetes is amputations, but also skin issues. And when you think about trying to evacuate through muddy and toxic filled waters, that was common in New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina. That's a disgusting venture for anyone, but for someone who's a diabetic who has skin issues, it was potentially dangerous, if not deadly. And so these are the questions that I often think about, and that I teach about and that I research about. And I can't sort of let this moment go without talking about a moment here in Texas. And some of these stories, I'm not sure if they've made national news yet, but just last night, there's word of a woman, elderly woman, who died from hypothermia in her apartment last week because of the power outage. And it speaks to a longer history of this kind of thing happening to vulnerable elderly people. I'm thinking about Eric Klinenberg's work on the 1995 Chicago heat wave, when elderly people essentially died in their homes, high-rise apartments. Many of them had outlived their social networks, family and friends, no one to check on them. There was not an infrastructure to come and take them to a cooling center. And so the only reason that some of them were found was for one of two reasons. Either their rent was due and the landlord came looking, or their bodies began to decompose over the course of weeks, and people called the landlord and entered the apartment and found these individuals. So, these questions of environmental racism, structural issues, lack of planning, lack of protections for the vulnerable, is something that we must continue to talk about and think about in spaces like this and beyond. Moving forward, as Laura said, I'm currently writing a history of race and diabetes, but I also have these sort of overlapping, sort of competing interests. And one of them is the history of lead poisoning. And it's sort of been a long-standing interest of mine because it fits with my sort of interest of chronic disease, but also environmentalism, race, and infrastructure. Lead poisoning is considered to be, one of the most dangerous elements in the world. But we've known about the dangers of lead poisoning since at least the 19th century, late 19th century, if not before. It's a naturally forming metal in the Earth's core, used in ceramics, tiles, trade, pipes moving to and from cities, carrying water and sewage. It is used in paint as a coagulant and also in gasoline to reduce engine knocking in the early part of the 20th century. Some of the symptoms of lead poisoning includes irritability, loss of appetite, abdominal pain, vomiting, convulsions, and can lead to neurological, kidney and heart problems and subclinical sort of impacts as well for many children. But by the 1930s, lead poisoning was really becoming a housing issue. It was becoming a housing issue because many of the units in cities like New York, Chicago, and Baltimore were painted with lead paint. And so, typical as you might imagine, there was a blame game. right? So the lead industry blamed the housing authority blamed the lead industry. And the lead industry, of course, by this time was putting together a 50-year advertising campaign known as the Dutch Boy to provide or to eliminate sort of common knowledge of the dangers of lead poisoning, understanding that if it became common knowledge of lead's dangers, that would impact significantly its bottom line. And so there was a willful ignorance around the dangers of lead poisoning for much of the 20th century. But what's important to think about is that this became a civil rights issue. And we often don't think about the activism during the civil rights era, the environmentalism, the environmental ethics that were part of the civil rights issue or civil rights movement in places like Chicago and Baltimore and New York City. In Chicago, there was a relatively two short-lived organizations, one called the Student Organization for Urban Leadership, founded in 1964, and Citizens Committee to End Lead Poisoning, founded in 1965. Both went door to door in Chicago, South Side and sort of West Chicago, to collect urine samples and sort of paint chips off of the side of windows to take to labs for testing. And the NAACP was very active in this sort of question of lead poisoning, but also the Black Panther Party in Chicago, other cities as well, including Portland, Oregon, had a lead abatement program, relatively short-lived, but they were very aware of this danger of sort of this, dangerous element within the environment of many people living in these cities. The Young Lords Party in New York City mostly, which was an offshoot or emerged out of the Black Panther Party, I should say, also created a lead abatement program in New York City. And so these questions I would pose to you have a long genesis, and it's important for us to think about these questions. And the Black Panther Party and other organizations demanded policies to address lead poisoning, demanded screening programs, education about the dangers of lead, and housing reforms. And one sort of interesting point or moment about lead poisoning was that Jimmy Collier, who was a folk singer who sometimes opened for Martin Luther King in the 1960s, wrote a song about lead poisoning called Lead Poison on the Wall in 1968. Lead poison on the walls, he says, kills little guys and little dolls. It kills them big and it kills them small, while we stand by and watch them fall. And the landlord does nothing to stop it all. That death on the wall. And I include that because there's so many ways that we can think about environmentalism and sort of critiques of the environmental world. I make the point in my first book that it was really Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston, who were the first to really sort of elevate for a broader public the dangers of the environmental world for a consuming public. And so the use of music, the use of popular culture, I think is an important way for us to think about these questions and think about these issues moving forward. And of course, these issues are still front and center, which Professor Jones will talk about in a moment with the Flint disaster, which is still ongoing. And so I'll end then as well with this sort of idea of how lead poisoning is still with us and how there's still so much about lead poisoning that we don't know. People often, I teach courses on race and racism in American science and medicine. And we talk about, Tuskegee. And as I've said in a lot of interviews recently, dealing with COVID and other issues, Tuskegee is just the tip of the iceberg in many ways. There were, a lot of experimentation that occurred before Tuskegee and that occurred after Tuskegee. And one of those moments was the Kennedy-Krieger study at Johns Hopkins University in 1990, which was a 6-year study that deliberately exposed low-income Black children from 108 families to lead poisoning. to determine the consequences of various levels of lead exposure. No informed consent was provided, did not inform parents of the true nature of the study. In 2001, the Maryland Court of Appeals ruled in a strongly worded ruling that Johns Hopkins University engaged in unethical research by willfully subjecting Black children to lead. And so, these issues are still around us. Various ideas, aspects of environmental racism are all around us. And I look forward to having this conversation about this, but also some other ways that we can think about this very important issue. And so with that, I will turn it over to Professor Kimberly Jones.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mizelle. Thank you. That was fantastic and a great segue to what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, if all goes well. All right. Hopefully you all can see my screen. So I'm an environmental engineer by training, and I do research on water quality. So I started my career because I thought it was important to make sure we as environmental engineers could design water treatment facilities and wastewater treatment facilities to try to make sure our water is safe. And so these issues around water that come up are always really interesting to me because it kind of goes to the root of, who I am as an environmental engineer. So today I would like to talk to you a lot about environmental racism in general, with a specific focus on issues around water quality. And I want to just give, I just want to acknowledge the author. I don't know if you can see behind me, my son is an artist. He likes to paint. So I'm always intrigued by people who express things through art. So this is an environmental justice poster made by an artist, Ricardo Morales. I don't know him personally, but I thought his rendering of environmental justice was good. So I want to start with something I think a lot of us would agree with, and that's that we have a global water crisis in our world. The National Academy of Engineers called this out back in 2008. And at the time, they probably wouldn't have imagined that in 2021, this issue hasn't gone away. I mean, every few minutes a child dies from a water-related disease. We have millions of people who live without access to safe water every day, and billions of people who live without access to proper sanitation. But a lot of times we assume that these problems happen in developing countries. But in fact, we have a water crisis right here in the United States. And it's something that we all too often don't really acknowledge. And not only do we have a water crisis in the United States, but communities of color and low-income communities shoulder the brunt of these water crises here in the United States. And for example, I just will throw out some numbers here, and I'll talk a little bit about them later. But as you may know, our water is regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. So there are very strict rules about the level of contamination that can be in our water. So theoretically, every person in our country who turns on their tap should be able to be very secure in knowing that the water is safe to drink. But in a lot of small and rural communities and a lot of urban communities, that's actually not the case. We have a lot of water systems that are in violation of our Safe Drinking Water Act every year. And between 9 and 45 million of Americans received water from a source that violated the Safe Drinking Water Act in a 30-year period. So we have to do better in our country with delivering water that is safe to drink. I do believe water is a basic right for all people. We should be able to have access to safe, reliable water every day. So I want to draw the line from kind of water treatment and water quality to environmental justice. So we know that environmental justice is actually a response to increase awareness of environmental racism. And this started, it's been going on for, as Professor Mizelle mentioned, it's been going on for years. But one of the first cases that it really got reached to national attention was back in 1982, when there was a protest against the creation of a toxic landfill in a community in North Carolina. And they were going to dump 6,000 truckloads of soil with PCBs in this community. And the residents, they protested. I think there were about 6 weeks of protests that followed. About 500 people were arrested. And in the end, they ended up, dumping the soil in a landfill. But the win was that that situation really brought a lot more attention to this issue of environmental racism. And fast forward in 2014, a company in North Carolina, Duke Energy, they put coal ash. Coal ash is a byproduct of coal power plants. And they put these sometimes in landfills. And one of their coal ash lagoons leaked. And this bottom picture is a picture of the coal ash leak into the Dan River, which I think it impacted about 70 miles downriver of this site. And so you can see here in this picture, this gray area is the coal ash, and this brown area is the river under it. And so that was an issue where, we have this huge environmental issue. And it affected people of color. So I put these two they're separated by time, but you can see from 1982 to 2014, we still have issues where people are being exposed to environmental contamination, not due to anything they've done, but these tend to disproportionately impact communities of color. And so just so you know, it's not the issue in North Carolina impacted, it got a lot of attention because residents or people in a community started to document the spill. And so this middle picture here, this kind of shows as a picture that was taken. You can see here, this gray area is a coal ash, and then this kind of brown area is just the river itself. And on the left, I'm kind of showing you how this happens when you have a landfill. If it's not lined properly, then over time, some of the contaminants can leach out, and they can leach out into groundwater. They can end up leaching out to surface water. When it rains, that rain can bring some of the contaminants from the soil down to the aquifer, and it can get out to streams. It can contaminate fish, people who are fishing in the water. Ultimately, it may be someone's drinking water source. So water contamination is a big deal, and is something that, I don't know if people always understand that when you have a landfill, you have to be very careful about how you line it and how you design it properly so that over years it won't allow contaminants to leach out. And over here on the right, you can see this is what, after years and years of litigation, lawsuits, Duke Energy was finally forced to excavate all 14 of their coal ash lagoons and build line storage tanks. And then that's on the right, this is a engineered landfill that's engineered a lot better, so it's less likely that it would leak and contaminate the environment. So Flint is something that has gotten, a lot of you are probably aware of. And so I wanted to talk specifically about some of the issues with Flint, just how it happened from more of a technical standpoint, because, when I first became an engineer, I really thought there was this thick line, this separation between what we think about as an engineers and in a technical community, and really how things are implemented from a policy standpoint. I said, our job is to really do the good science and then hand it over to the policymakers, and they'll do the right thing and implement our designs equitably and properly. But Flint just was an egregious example of where that all, kind of goes wrong. And so just to review what happened in Flint. So this is just a small map of Flint. You see Flint is here. In the middle, Flint had been getting their water piped from Detroit's water treatment plant. It was more expensive. Flint had some financial issues. And so in order to save money, a decision was made to stop getting money from Detroit, through the Detroit pipeline, and get water instead from the KWA pipeline from Lake Huron. So Lake Huron is here. It's a water source that Detroit uses. It was also going to be used for Flint. The issue is it was under construction when this decision was made. So as a stopgap, they decided to use water from the Flint River, which is this small river here, and treat that water through the Flint water treatment plant, which had been closed for a time, but then was kind of reopened in order to treat water for Flint. And pretty quickly, the residents of Flint started complaining about brown water. This picture in the upper right, these are some pipes from Flint, and you can see they're really badly corroded, because what happened was the Flint River, what no one really designed for ultimately in a treatment plan, was that the amount of chloride in a river was really high, partially because of de-icing. You know, when it snows, when there's ice on a road, you de-ice the road, a lot of salts are then washed into the river. So the amount of chloride in that river had gone up, I think about an order of magnitude of about 60 over the past maybe 20 or 30 years. And so that water was really not a great water source for the pipes. So it started to corrode the pipes. When pipes corrode, if they're lead pipes, then that allows lead to leach out in the water. An additional issue was when lead leaches, it exhibits a chlorine demand. So water is also disinfected in a water treatment plant. But when there's a demand for the chlorine, then the chlorine is not as effective. So that chlorine was not as effective. And so you also had people complaining of Legionella in the water, and they were actually measured Legionella in the water. And they also had issues about, so they had to increase the chlorine in order to kill the bacteria. When they increased the level of chlorine, it reacted with some of the organics in the water and formed what we call trihalomethanes. Trihalomethanes are suspected carcinogens. You cannot have a high concentration in your water. So the trihalomethane concentration increased, the lead in the water increased, and all these things kind of came together to create a very dangerous situation for the residents of Flint. And it resulted in just finally they had to shut down the water treatment plant and bring bottled water to the residents. But I think there were about 17 months between when the residents started complaining about, you know, the water smells funny, it looks funny, the children have rashes, it's causing all these adverse health effects. And when they finally said, okay, we have to do something for this community, it's causing this huge problem. And that is just absolutely too long, and it erodes public trust. So, you know, it's a huge problem. I want to just quickly go over what, you know, just what should have happened. And that's this is around the time that the issues happened in Flint. I got, you know, some folks were contacting me saying, you know, you want to comment on this? The science was wrong. And in fact, the issues around lead in pipes, as Dr. Mizelle mentioned, this is not, we are well aware of the public health issues around lead. And in the water treatment industry, we understand how to prevent or reduce lead in water. The thing is, a lot of cities have aging infrastructure, and so they still have a lot of lead pipes. In most cities, even if there are lead pipes, those pipes many times are coated with kind of a layer that develops over time. And that layer, it's kind of this passivation layer here, that layer is created over time, and it actually really protects the pipe from corrosion. But and so this top picture is a picture of a lead or iron pipe, and this is, you know, with treated water that's properly treated at the proper pH. It has, you know, it doesn't corrode the pipe. Even if it's a lead pipe, it probably won't cause an adverse health effect. But when they switched to Flint River water, that had a lot of, that had a higher chloride dose that was more corrosive to the pipes. So it ate away at this passivation layer, and it allowed the lead, or if it's an iron pipe, or the iron to leach out into the water, created a chlorine demand, and we got all those issues that we mentioned earlier. Also, sometimes water treatment plants add an orthophosphate. Orthophosphate can form a thicker layer on the pipe. So they didn't add orthophosphate, nor did they reduce the chloride concentration of water to prevent the pipes from eroding. So the science is well established. It just was not conducted properly. They did not add the chemicals they should have added to the water to protect the residents of Flint. And so it's a long road to recovery. Some things have been done. On the left, there's a map now that I think some scientists from University of Michigan and Georgia Tech have, some data scientists have come up with a map where a Flint resident can actually in real time figure out where the lead replacement situation is. Right now, they are rapidly, years later, replacing the lead service lines. And you can, if you're a resident there, you can go here, put in your address and see what the status is. This middle picture, this is just, kind of shows people actually, workers replacing the lead pipes with copper pipes. But this picture on the right shows there's a huge distrust in anything that the government officials are saying about the water quality. And it's because of those years between when they switched to Flint River and then when they finally switched back to Detroit, all those years of incorrect information being given to the residents, and they were basically ignored when they were complaining about all these adverse health effects from the water. And so now, understandably, the residents don't really believe the government officials who are saying the water is safe, here are the tests, you can drink your water, but there's still this distrust that will take years, I think, to rebuild. I just want to switch really quickly, and I know my time is probably almost running out, but just to give an idea that the issue in Flint is not the only issue around water. The issue around lead in our pipes, Flint is not the only case. I live in Washington, D.C. In D.C., we had an issue of lead in our water even before the Flint incident. But also, we have water insecurity issues in the United States. And this is a nice graphic that just shows, again, I think for many people, it may be surprising that there are actually a lot of folks in the United States that don't have access to plumbed piping for water. So, you assume most people in the United States have piped water coming into their houses, but we actually see that there are a high percentage, if you see these lighter, as it gets more yellow, those are households without piped water access, higher numbers without piped water access. And as you see here, they're in a lot of the urban areas in our country. And the study showed that urban households headed by people of color are about 35% more likely to lack piped water connections. And also lower income households are more susceptible to lack of piped water access. So that is another issue we have in this country. When you think about things like other issues like COVID-19, if you don't have piped water, you're not able to wash your hands and do the proper health, public health things that you should be doing to reduce your chances of getting sick. So we also have an issue in a lot of rural communities where a lot of small rural communities are unable to meet some of the drinking water regulations. And this just shows different violations from 1980 to 2015 and the number of violations on the y-axis. And you see the total number of violations, I'll just highlight this dark blue line, tends to go up every time a new rule is enacted. You see the violations go up, and that's because a lot of these small rural water treatment plants don't have the capacity to update their plant to meet these new regulations. And you can also see when you look at that as a function of income and rural versus suburban communities, you can see that if you live in a rural low income community, you're a lot more likely to live someplace that has water violations, with water that has violated some kind of regulation, and the lower numbers in the more urban areas. And I just want to end with this. I have a couple more slides, but I just wanted to, I said in my talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the federal government is doing. They are aware of this issue about environmental justice. Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12898, which deals with environmental justice. And so that act was meant to infuse environmental justice or concepts of environmental justice all throughout government agencies. So they wanted to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of minority and low-income populations, develop a strategy for implementing environmental justice, and promote non-discrimination in federal programs that affect human health and the environment. And at the bottom, I just have an environmental justice definition. The definition of environmental justice really depends on where you are. But this is the official definition of the US government. And they also have enacted an Office of Environmental Justice to try to act as a coordinating force among these different agencies to make sure environmental justice issues are met. And I have a link at the bottom. They have a whole environmental justice 2020 agenda where they call out national challenges such as lead disparities, drinking water, air quality, and these hazardous waste sites. As you saw from a lot of these examples, we have a long way to go in there. So what can we do? I want to end with just kind of some thoughts about what we can do. In many cases, as I said before, as I keep mentioning, we think of those of us who are water quality experts. I'll say me. I used to think of my role as just, I'm a researcher. I think about innovative ways to treat our drinking water. But my time on the Science Advisory Board, EPA Science Advisory Board, really taught me the importance of making sure all of the regulations and policy decisions have a strong scientific underpinning. We have to make sure these decisions are made with scientific integrity, make sure the science is backing them. But we can't do our work without the strong partnership of stakeholders, and that's those in the community. For Flint, with the issues in North Carolina, it was really people in a community who really raised the bell before any scientist or policymaker even knew there was a problem. So it is so important that all of these communities kind of work together. And I put up here, my idea of, who some of those folks should be. So the researchers need to work with community groups. They need to work with elected officials and government staffers to make sure that we're all at the table, we're all represented at the table when these decisions are being made. So that is it. I want to thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the following discussion. And I now want to yield the floor to Mr. Henderson.
All right. Hopefully I will get my slideshow up. Cool. So hello, everybody. As mentioned before, my name is Adin. I am a current senior studying environmental studies with a concentration in sociology. I'm also here representing the Black Student Forum in my capacity as their co-president. So I just like to start off by first saying that it is an honor to be virtually sharing the stage with Dr. Mizelle and Dr. Jones. And I would also like to thank the Schiller Institute's Environmental Justice Planning Committee for giving me this opportunity, as well as all of the behind the scenes work that was put in to this event. So I hope that my talk today, it's going to be a little more zoomed out, and I hope to give or provide a roadmap for other college students or anybody who is interested in shifting, I guess, a mindset towards thinking about issues of environmental racism. And for me, that starts my freshman year. So you will see 3 questions on the slide. It says, who am I? What am I good at? And what am I called to become? And so those of you within the Boston College community know that BC teaches a course called Courage to Know. It's a freshman only course. It's 1 semester. I took it my fall semester with a professor named TKM. If he's out there, how are you doing, TKM? But this provided me with an opportunity to reflect on my past and also think about my future at Boston College. And while this course can be tweaked by each professor to their liking, it is underpinned by these 3 courses, or questions, sorry. And so when thinking about the first question, who am I think I'd answer it by saying, firstly, I am indecisive in that I'm the kind of person who will go to a restaurant and sit looking at a menu for about 15 minutes, trying to decide whether I'm gonna have the mac and cheese or the hamburger. And by the time that the server comes to take my order, I'll end up ordering the fish and chips. And so nonetheless, when I first heard this question, I was very overwhelmed. I mean, I knew that my name was Adin Henderson. I knew that I was interested in environmental studies. I knew that I'm good at music, and I had no clue what I was gonna be called upon to become. But there's also another way for me to answer that question, in that I'm also the person who always asks the extra question. I know my mom is out there somewhere in the virtual stratosphere, and she can definitely attest to the fact that when I was a kid, I was constantly asking questions. I'd never stop. And so I did not know it at the time, nor did I honestly know it a week ago. But when reflecting on my time at Boston College, I think that these 2 traits are what led me to shape my Boston College experience around pursuing my academic interest in environmental racism. So this is also particularly relevant, I think, to the work that I did the summer after my sophomore year. So true to my indecisive nature, I was presented with an opportunity to conduct some research, and I was also presented with an internship. And I had such a hard time deciding which one to do. I decided, why not do both? And so I spent the summer firstly doing research under an undergraduate research fellowship with Dr. Brian Garreau of the sociology department. I was working on a specific study that was looking at how New England cranberry farmers and their social networks impact impacted their ways to be able to mitigate or respond to extreme weather events. And I did have a very minor role in the study. I was making an annotated bibliography, but my main role was reading a ton of the existing literature and finding themes and underlining them. And one of the themes that I found was that the more, or the greater the social network that each farmer had, the more that they were able to respond and mitigate environmental risks. And I thought that that was very interesting because at the same time, I was working as a volunteer summer intern at Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or CREW. And CREW is a Cambridge-based environmental nonprofit that is tasked with building ground roots climate resilience. And it really focuses on providing these marginalized communities with climate information that help them navigate the inevitable climate extreme weather events that are going to happen. And so thinking about, I guess, climate and extreme weather events, we know that populations that are going to be the disenfranchised populations are going to be hit first. And so why not cater the information to them so that when it happens, they're going to be able to effectively act and mitigate the risk. And so what we did was we would have information as simple as heat wave preparedness, coastal flooding, what happens when power goes out, and we'd work to translate it into different languages. For example, we worked with an initiative called the Haiti Coalition in Chelsea, and we gave a presentation on how to respond to a heat wave when your power goes out, and we had it translated to Creole. And so I started to realize that these social networks were also building resilience similar to the same resilience that I saw in the farmers in the literature that I was reading. And this research that I was doing, coupled with my natural tendency to always ask the extra question, and specifically as Dr. Jones mentioned in her presentation, the increasing awareness of environmental racism leads you to adopt an environmental justice lens. And that's exactly what happened to me. I had a little voice in the back of my mind, and I started asking myself, how is one's ability to build social networks influenced by their position in society? And thinking about who climate information is catered to and why, I started to question whether climate information is catered to those who actually need it and who are going to be hit the hardest by climate change, or if it's catered to those who are just interested in maintaining the status quo as long as possible. And this led to my understanding of environmental racism, because I have a sociology concentration, and so that is my background. And thinking about how I saw in my research with Dr. Garreau, farmers being able to mitigate environmental risks based on their social networks, I realized that society is stratified. And so that's gonna depend, or their ability to mitigate is going to depend on their position in society. And so I started asking, who has time to build these networks? Who has time to seek resources? And what audience is this information being catered towards? And I think that I had a class sophomore year about society and environmental transformations. And the professor drove home a point to me where they said that when the sea level rise happens, Times Square in New York City is always going to build a seawall, but it's where the water is pushed that matters. And I was thinking about why aren't the resources and information being targeted to the communities that are going to be hit the hardest? And thinking about the situation in Texas, as Dr. Mizelle was talking about, and thinking about how we saw Senator Cruz board a plane and hop to Cancun, I think that that is almost a snapshot into what's going to happen, where those with the resources or those that have the exit power to get up and leave are going to leave, and leave those who are suffering to, again, as Dr. Mizelle was saying, die of hypothermia in their apartment unless they have the natural resources and infrastructure. And so in terms of pursuing solutions, I'd like to take a second to quickly talk about my senior thesis, which I'm doing under Dr. Andrew Jorgensen of the sociology department. And basically, the question that I'm trying to address is, how is one's perception of what constitutes an environmental risk influenced or varied based on their socioeconomic status? Because I think that risk perception is a huge factor when it comes to addressing issues of environmental racism and addressing issues of environmental injustices. Because a lot of what I've read, in I guess an extensive amount of reading I've done on the topic, is always from an academic perspective. And throughout my literature review for my specific thesis, it was very rare that I'd find a study that was actually on the ground talking to people who are being impacted and asking how are they perceiving the risks. Because I wonder if things can be more effective if we find a way to couple the pursuit of systemic change in the inherent pursuit of environmental justice with a smaller scale mobilization to provide these individuals with their immediate needs. And I hope that I could find some novel approach or some issue that's not being addressed. And the little QR code you see in the bottom right of your screen, I'm still in the process of collecting information. And so if you are interested in being part of my study, you can point the camera at that little QR code, tap it, and it'll take you to a link, and we can set up a time for an interview. And I greatly appreciate that. And I think this drives me to, I guess, the underlying point of what I'm talking about. And I mean this as an imperative, in that environmental justice must take into consideration racial justice. And I'm gonna try to explain this using the concept of internal colonialism with a hypothetical situation that I made up about 10 minutes ago. And so we have two people. We have Henry and we have Kate. They live 3 miles apart. They have the same zip code. Like they are very similar geographically speaking. However, Henry lives in a gated community where Kate lives in public housing. Henry has a big house that uses a ton of electricity. And interestingly enough, the power plant is right next to Kate's home. Henry's in great health. He can spend as much time as he wants on extracurriculars, schoolwork, getting that extra SAT tutor, where on the other hand, Kate often misses school because she developed asthma at a young age due to exposure to particulate matter as a result of her living in close proximity to the power plant. In this situation, Henry is benefiting directly at the expense of Kate. Henry, in his energy consumption, is polluting Kate's neighborhood. Henry, in his wealth in his neighborhood, is sucking the resources, and that when thinking about the approach of NIMBY, or not in my backyard, whenever a waste incinerator or landfill comes up, Henry's neighborhood's gonna be like, no, we don't want that, put it in Kate's neighborhood. And Kate won't have the power to fight back against that. And then when you think about the flip side of the same coin in terms of in my backyard, whenever it comes to thinking about parks, libraries, funded schools, public commodities, Henry's gonna be like, give me all of that. They're gonna put that in his backyard and he's gonna have access to it. And this functions similar to a colony in that it also mirrors America's past of systemic racism, in that we live in a country right now that industrialized directly at the expense of Black and Indigenous people of color. And it continues to this day through environmental racism. And so when I go back to the imperative that I have on the screen, in that we can't have environmental justice without racial justice, because if you don't address the root cause in racial justice, the system will just repeat itself. And this is very similar to my personal beliefs surrounding divestment. I think that divestment simply on its own is not enough to achieve environmental justice and racial equity, because it cannot be the be all, or it cannot be the end of the story. It can be a stepping stone for which we use for advocacy, but at the end of the day, something else needs to be done to ensure that when divestment happens, the cycle does not find another way to repeat itself by becoming green at the expense of these disenfranchised populations, because you must address the root problem or else it will just repeat itself as it has throughout history. And so to end, I think about the title of this event in challenging environmental racism, stressful landscapes, toxic exposures, and what one BC student's doing about that. And I guess that one BC student is me. And so how I got here, I don't really know, but I've written some notes along the way. And so I've embraced my indecisiveness, and I've realized that I can combine my passion for environmental justice, environmental racism, and my passion for racial advocacy. I never stopped asking those questions, in that I sometimes drive myself mad trying to figure one thing out because there's always more questions to come. I think my mom can also attest. I'm in the process of applying to law schools, and it took me about maybe 3 months to finally finish my personal statement because I just wanted to keep tweaking it. Probably drove her crazy. But you also might think back to the 3 questions that I had in the beginning, and I haven't really addressed what am I meant to become, because to be honest, I still have no clue. And I think that that's completely fine, because I think that the act of asking myself that question in of itself, regardless of my ability to find an answer, has led me to realize that as long as I'm taking the time to ask myself what I need to do to further my passions, I can do it. And so I think in terms of people thinking about an issue of environmental racism, it's very big, it's very macro, but I would really urge people to think that nothing is really too small. I mean, you can have a change of mindset, and that's going to be contagious in terms of if you start asking that same question and or the same questions that I have going in the back of my head, or you start questioning things and channel that and ask your friend, maybe your friend will adopt a similar approach in the future. And so that's where my presentation is going to end. And I hope I was successful in providing some glimpse into how I have used my Boston College experience as a vehicle to shape my environmental and racial advocacy.
Thank you all so much for these really interesting views of this set of questions. I'm thinking here about Dr. Jones's map, where there's the connector, right, but that goes across communities that took water, and unfortunately took water in a way that led to the contamination of families and children's bodies. And I'm wondering if y'all panelists see either connections between your presentations, or in particular, if you see ways in which some of the sort of case studies you've given us connect urban areas and rural areas. I think we often think of those as being separate kinds of question areas. And are there particular ways of conceptualizing environmental justice as racial justice that might help you all see the connections between city places and country places differently?
I'll start just by, saying that's a great question. It's, when you think about water and water sources, it's one thing I always say, it's one person, you have water and wastewater treatment plants situated wherever they are, but wastewater treatment plants, usually their effluent line goes into a body of water, and a lot of that body of water at some point is going to be someone else's drinking water source. So you cannot, you cannot differentiate, when you think about a watershed, it's harder to talk about urban versus rural when you talk about a water source, because it's all kind of connected. You think about Chesapeake Bay, it flows through several, it's Delaware, Pennsylvania, but it's the same, kind of body source of water. And so you can't make a hard line between an urban and a rural area. But what is different is really the ability of the water treatment plants are different in a rural or urban area, as I mentioned in my talk, but the body of water connects all those areas.
I'll jump in. First, let me give a shout out to Adin Henderson. I don't know what I was doing when I was a senior, but it wasn't that. But I was thinking about, Professor Jones' sort of conversation around water and sort of the long history of water issues in certain communities. And it sort of sparked this question that I've often thought about, which is, when does a disaster end, right? When does a disaster begin and when does a disaster end? Because we often have water issues here in Houston. I was thinking that the last time I was on an airplane was about a year ago this time, and flew back into Houston. And right as the global pandemic was occurring, we also had a boil water advisory in the city because of E. coli in the water. And so once every year and a half or so, somewhere around Houston is under a boil water advisory because of water issues. I have not consumed the water here since I moved here, basically. There's some things you can't avoid, but we always use boil or bottled water. And so, we sometimes think about this, in terms of a disaster, but then, the momentum changes and the momentum moves to something else. But in many ways, the disaster is still there. And I think until we change our mindset to sort of think about the chronic issues of water problems across different landscapes, I think we'll be in this, similar situation. I was also thinking of Adin's point of how did I get here? I didn't intend to be an environmental historian. I was interested in the 1927 flood, and somehow I decided, well, I think I have to know something about environmental. Thank you, Conevery. I think I have to know something about environmental history to write this book, and then that sort of pushed me into thinking about broader questions of environmental racism. So mentor students in the Mellon Foundation who, are writing such, fascinating projects. And sometimes they do not know that they are actually writing a paper that deals with environmental racism. And then I kind of subtly, move them in that direction. So there's so much research to be done out there that it's important that we address these issues.
And if I can just jump in for a minute too, I'm actually trained as an environmental engineer, and went through Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans, and I was a professor at Tulane University. And one of the things that happened with Hurricane Katrina is that we spent mostly the federal government ended up spending about $15 billion to protect the city of New Orleans in the future from what we call the 100-year storm event, the 100-year hurricane event. But, I'm thinking about cities versus rural. Well, that's all great for New Orleans, although many would argue 100-year protection isn't sufficient either. But the problem is that there are so many other low-lying areas along the coastline of Louisiana, Iberia, Homa, etc. They have maybe 10 years protection. So protection from a 10-year storm, not even the 100-year storm. So these rural areas are still not getting the same attention, the necessary attention for their residents, as some larger areas where there's more sort of national understanding or concern about a particular urban area. And so I think that's another question that we have to deal with. Let me just add, because I'm not sure we've said this, we are going to be taking Q&A from the audience in probably maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So if anyone in the audience has questions for the panelists, this is a time to put them into the chat, into the Q&A section.
And we got some fascinating questions ahead of time, many of which focused on some version of, well, what can I do? And one of the things I was hearing in y'all's presentations were the various skill sets that people were taking on or using. So Mr. Henderson talked to us about the powerful act of translation, right? And of making both culturally relevant and linguistically accessible materials about climate events. Dr. Mizelle talked to us about music, right? And how singing about the 1927 flood was one way in which a lot of populations in the United States, without much national voice, were able to get information out and be quite literally heard. And Dr. Jones, you spoke with us about the ways, the science of pipes. And one of the things that I have really been bowled over by, listening to the news about Flint, is the way in which folks who do not speak with, PhD diction, who are in Flint, have acquired knowledge of water chemistry, right? Who will go on TV or on the radio and school national reporters about what kind of lining you need in your pipes, because they've had to learn that. So what my question to you all would be, when people want to know what to do, what are the sort of levers, right, that can promote change, right? Do we need to be looking at music? Do we need to be creating more networks, as you're suggesting, Mr. Henderson? Do we need to encourage local communities to up their level of scientific awareness and their scientific kind of vocabulary? What are the sort of strategies that individuals can take on for ourselves or our communities in situations where we feel like we're seeing or living situations of environmental injustice?
I think I could definitely start off on that question. And I think, in my opinion, in order to promote change, you really need to work or start small and get big. I think it's, especially in an institution or university, I'm thinking specifically about calls for divestment or even calls for racial justice. And I think that in terms of what I've seen in my 4 years here, a lot of the time we call for these overarching change, yet we haven't addressed the small things that would set the foundation for that change to stick. And so in terms of like calling for divestment or calling for racial justice, there are maybe 3 to 5 steps you take in between where you call for smaller scale change, like make a commitment to sending the Pulse program into these communities and building social networks there, or making a commitment at a smaller level, like we're doing right now with the Environmental Justice Initiative within the Schiller Institute, to start setting that foundation. And I believe that once the foundation is set, the larger structural change is often much more attainable.
I would agree. I'm with kind of starting small and kind of having it grow. And I want to say also, in terms of communities and schools, I do believe I'm always I give so much credit to these communities that kind of go out and refuse to be silenced or refuse to be ignored when they know something is not right. You know, they know, wait, something's not right. And they can have, you know, folks say, no, it's fine. No, really, it's okay. We've tested it. You know, that something's not right. And they are insistent and they continue to make their voices heard. And so I think one thing we could do is also just take off this, I think, constructive view that you have to have a certain degree or you have to have a certain amount of education to be able to speak in, you know, you mentioned it, you have these folks in Flint who now, you know, can speak with as much authority as anyone on these issues. But I think just in general, we have to, you know, take the mystery out of science and just you know, this is something that folks can understand. And then we need to speak with a language that, you know, not with our kind of esoteric acronyms and all these things, but just speak in a way and that everyone can understand, not just assume, okay, unless you're an environmental engineer or unless you're an environmental lawyer or whatever, you won't know what I'm saying. You know, no, these are issues that touch people's lives every day and they should absolutely be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I was, you know, when I was researching my 1927 book, I came across a gentleman by the name of Mr. Frank Broussard, who was head of the Frenchtown Community Association. And part of what he and his organization had been doing the previous 10, 15 years was fighting for an off-ramp to their community. Frenchtown is a small community underneath I-10 bordering downtown Houston. And the highway system was essentially constructed to segregate and discipline Frenchtown community away from the downtown area. So in addition to constructing a highway through essentially the middle of the community, they didn't give them an off-ramp. So you had to essentially go down the highway, exit, and then come back to Frenchtown. And so, you know, he didn't do it individually. He created networks. He had an organization. He worked with other organizations in Houston. And over time, they were able to essentially force the city. And it really was forcing the city to give them an off-ramp. And you see these, you know, all over the place. I was listening to a presentation years and years ago now. I think it's by a scholar by the name of Jacoby Wilson, talking about a water treatment plant in Mebane, North Carolina, where they built the water treatment center or plant in a Black neighborhood, but didn't pipe the water to the Black community. They piped the water across or essentially right through the Black community to the white side of town and neighboring communities. And I'm actually not sure if that community ever got that water, but, you know, just think about that image of not having access to this water, but, you know, this sort of loud, monstrous sort of treatment plant is in your community. And so they mobilized around that and attempted to bring about change. And as Professor Jones and Mr. Henderson were saying, you know, if you know something, say something, do something, and you know, we can sort of quietly, slowly, and over time help to bring about change.
That segues into a couple of questions we're seeing from the folks who were part of this larger conversation and who are on this presentation. The folks who are the panelists on this call represent three different major institutions: Howard University, University of Houston, Boston College. And a couple different folks are sort of phrasing a question about how people in those kinds of universities can respond. And actually, Professor Steinberg, you might want to be on for some of this as well, because I think this might speak to some of the role of institutions like the Schiller Institute. So some of the questions we're seeing are things like, welcome back, what can faculty and students at universities do to create networks, you know, with each other to effect change? And what are the ways in which people in universities can resist the kind of forcing of esoteric research? Like, how can we assert the relevance or maybe, give credence to research that is practical and on the ground, as well as more theoretical kinds of research. So in other words, a couple different questions about what are the practical means by which folks in universities in institutions of higher education can effectively help be agents of empowerment to our nearby communities.
Well, I think one thing we could do is just work directly with people in a community, bring them to the table in the beginning as we're thinking about our research project. I mean, as engineers, we design things that are utilized or that touch people every day, but we don't often enough, we don't have discussions with them before we implement some solution. We go to them and say, here's what we designed and here's how to use it. Instead of saying, is this an appropriate, do you think this is an appropriate design for you? Would you, do you have a better idea? How should we think about this design? What would work for you? And then, to go back and try, so I think more, what they call, co-production, actually collaborating with folks in a community, especially in the environmental community, because everything we do touches people without they have no control over it. You turn on your water, but they shouldn't be drinking bottled water. I just in my heart think as a water treatment person, every person should be able to turn on their water and there should be no question about whether or not their water is safe and reliable. So as we design these things, we do have to have folks at the table because it also helps to build trust. I think one of the issues we have around trust is because, we don't have everyone at the table often enough when these decisions are being made.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And I would say first and foremost, I think, speaking of my university, we don't do enough of this kind of research. And there are, people who are pushing for us to do more. We have a new medical school that's coming online, which hopefully is supposed to have an emphasis or focus on environmental health and community-centered environmental health that is sort of focused on the issues surrounding particularly the University of Houston, which in some areas is very depressed. But I think sort of building on what Professor Jones was saying, I think many of our students, particularly after Hurricane Katrina, have created projects, not just oral history projects, but policy initiatives through various centers, organizations on campus. Through the Department of History, we have a Center for Public History. And so there's always sort of voices of the community that we're using to engage the historical past, but using the historical past as a way to think about our present. Not just for other people, other scholars, but as a way of attempting to make a change significantly in the lives of those people in the Third Ward, but also broader Houston as well.
I think also speaking as I guess from the student perspective, I just actually recently had a conversation with my thesis advisor about this the other day, but I think it's very much instilled in us as students to have, or to aim to be groundbreaking. And in a way, you're meant to want to critique, and I don't mean in the constructive way, but you want to try to push your work as sort of the best work that's happening. And in a way, it kind of tears down things that are already in place. And I think when approaching something like environmental justice, environmental racism, racial equity, they're not problems that are going to be, or they're not issues that are going to be addressed alone. It needs more of a collaborative approach, which is, and I made this clear in some of the meetings talking about the Schiller Institute's environmental justice project that they're putting out for students. And I wanted to emphasize the fact that this is more of a collaborative approach and that you're not going to want to compete to solve this issue, because if everybody's working together, you can really build off of each other's ideas and maybe work towards something greater. But it took me until my senior year to realize this. And it was when Dr. Jorgensen said, like, it's fine if your research is kind of in line with what's already out there, like that's fine. And that was the first time I thought about it. So I think maybe if it's made clear, or that shift in mindset happens a little earlier on, some great things can happen.
Yeah, and Bill, I just want to say, Adin, you've been a tremendous influence for us as a member of the Environmental Racism Planning Committee at Schiller. And one of the ways that you've done that, as you just explicated, is that I mentioned earlier that we have the Institute is sponsoring student projects and addressing environmental racism and environmental justice. And we're not, as Adin said, we're not doing this in a competitive manner. So students, take a look at the website that we've put up the information about it on the chat early on, and see if you want to contribute your own personal statement, your own personal perspective, your own personal project addressing environmental racism and what you can do, how you want to think about it. And then what we want to do is highlight your work by placing those on our website, and by offering an actual half-day summit that we're holding in April, where we will highlight and amplify the works that our students have done at Boston College. Whether you do this in a group, whether you do it through a course, or whether you do it individually. But again, not in a competitive manner, but in a challenge. It's a challenge because we want to challenge you to do something, to take on a responsibility that you're comfortable with, to confront environmental racism in your own life.
Can I just add to that something quickly? I mean, I want to make this point that environmental racism is also about leisure. It's also about access to leisure. So it's important to broaden the parameters of this as well. And some of the works that I've sort of come up thinking about with Sylvia Washington Hood's, Packing Them In Archaeology of Environmental Racism in Chicago, talks about the segregation era fight to have access to parks or pools, leisurely spaces, beaches, those kinds of places. And that's something for us to think about as well. Andrew Carl talks about, how, African Americans owned coastlines of beachfront property in the early to mid 20th century that was essentially taken from them using coercive methods, provided by the federal government and state. And so that's a loss of economics, but it's also a loss of property and the ability to create leisure as well. And that's important to understand, this question of, how people enjoy nature. Talking to my parents, they both grew up during segregation, and tell stories about how they had to swim in waters with sharks and water moccasins because they did not have access to pools. And, people died because of, that environmental racism. And I was also thinking about Professor Jones' sort of discussion of water. Water is such a, fascinating component. You can do so much with water. Water has been used to discipline bodies, as well as, create forms of leisure. I've said in other places that, the origin of the 1919 Chicago race riot was water, when a swimmer crossed over an imaginary line and was stoned. So, water sort of moving from one place did not do away with the lines of segregation, right? And also the way water was used during the civil rights movement to discipline Black bodies, pushing for equality in the Albany movement in Birmingham using fire hoses. So there's such a long history of environmental racism that so many people can think about for the historical past as a window into today.
A number of us on this call are in coastal areas, and many of us have roots in coastal areas. And a couple of questions have come in about the ways in which these the issues that we're talking about connect with global climate change and sea level rise. Any of you all want to offer any thoughts about the ways in which sea level rise in particular will require different forms of activism, or reactivate earlier forms of activism as we face this really large scale threat to a lot of our coastal communities?
I think I can definitely start by just reiterating one of the points that I made during my presentation, where when the time comes that New York City is experiencing sea level rise to the extent that it's going to start seeing some flooding, inner city, like right in Manhattan, Times Square, those areas are going to be fine. They're going to have the seawall, but it's not like the seawall is making the water disappear. It's going to disperse it. And so I think in terms of like organizing or activism, there really needs to be a push to make sure that the seawalls or whatever mitigation measures are implemented are being equitably distributed, because that's part of what we were doing with the Haiti Coalition, in that when the sea level rises in Boston specifically, Chelsea and that whole area of East Boston is all built on landfill. And so they're going to be some of the first communities to be experiencing flooding, yet the environment or the climate information that's being available to them is really not catered to their experiences. And so there needs to be also some sort of organizing similar to the work that's being done with CREW to bolster these communities and make sure that they're ready so that they're the first ones getting the seawall. And so that whenever the mitigation resources are put into place, they need to be equally distributed.
Well, I think that, places like South Carolina Low Country, many of those farmers are already experiencing some of the challenges of climate change. And as, people anticipate, longer hurricane seasons, more devastating hurricane seasons, it's the people who are the most vulnerable who will be impacted the most from hurricanes, from droughts, from other weather-related issues, who are most vulnerable before a particular disaster, but also, as I mentioned, in the aftermath of disaster as well. So those protections in place, and I'm a historian, so I tend to think about these things historically, right? So it's no one wants to do anything until after a disaster. People don't want to spend money to plan, unfortunately, especially for vulnerable communities. But as these storms become more prevalent and more disastrous, then again, it will be certain groups of people who will be left in the wake and will suffer the most.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm originally from, I live in DC now, but I'm from Hampton Roads, and Hampton Roads is an area that is really vulnerable to sea level rise. So I've been kind of following it. I still have family there and just kind of an interest in what's going on. And you see, as Professor Mizelle just mentioned, we have to think ahead, and you read about what's going on down there and they're thinking ahead, but what needs to happen also would be greater partnerships with those in a community, because it's like, okay, we're coordinating amongst agencies, we're coordinating amongst, but the question is, where, do the communities have a say? Are they involved in these discussions? When you're planning ahead, you have money to kind of, relocate infrastructure or, kind of shore up certain areas. Do you have community members engaged in those discussions? And I think that's key to make sure it's done equitably and not just, protecting certain, parts of an area.
I hear that connecting really strongly with Mr. Henderson's points, right, about networks and their power.
Absolutely. Yep.
We don't have much time left, but we've got a really interesting question that also has to do with coastal areas, about linkages between, especially in Louisiana, between colonial sugar production historically and the way in which that influenced coastal infrastructure. And is it, would it be appropriate then to be thinking at a societal level about reparations to address systemic inequities? I mean, that's a form of redress that we haven't yet brought up. So I just wanted to see if y'all have thoughts there. Or more broadly about kind of any of the ways in which you see the deeper history of some of these infrastructure patterns shaping the contemporary problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's an interesting question. I think that sort of the sugar production in Louisiana was sort of backbreaking, labor-intensive work, and as part of that, before or during slavery, sort of the environmental sort of landscape meant that sort of enslaved peoples were close to sort of plantations and plantation owners. After the Civil War, the environmental landscapes of discipline of bodies sort of pushed African Americans into a segregated landscape. In many ways, those roots of that discipline of Black bodies away from certain spaces can be connected from the antebellum and sort of Reconstruction era to the present, to the point where you see this divesting of infrastructure in Black communities evolving over the course of a century. But also the difficulty for African Americans throughout the segregated Jim Crow era to make a sort of livable wage for a number of different reasons. And also the difficulty I was thinking about when you were asking the question of Khalil Muhammad's sort of piece recently in the 1619 project about how they're close to, they're, under 5 sugar plantations or sugar farms owned by African Americans in the country. And that might not be exactly right, but it's very few. And what that means in terms of sort of economics, and the reasons for that were rooted in race and racism and environmental racism. So I do think that some form of reparations, is important to think about and consider because of that long history being rooted from slavery to the present. That's a roundabout way of answering that, but I think that's a really interesting question.
It's an interesting answer, and I don't know if the rest of y'all noticed the neat little way in which I made sure the historian got the last word there. Thank you all very much.
And it is my sad responsibility to have to bring this panel to a close. Dr. Mizelle, Dr. Jones, Mr. Henderson, Dr. Valencius, our moderator. I thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing your insights, being open to this conversation, being open to take the questions from the audience as well. Audience, you've been terrific. Most of you stayed on almost the entire time, offered us great questions. Even though I can't see you, audience, I know how transfixed you were by our terrific speakers and by our moderator. I thank you very much for bringing together historical perspectives, engineering perspectives, sociological perspectives, and the perspectives of what we can do out in the world beyond our academic homes. So I thank you very much and hope to see you all again.